Welcome everybody, this is SharePoint Patterns and Practices Webcast. And this time we're going to talk about something else not related, actually deep dive on the development of SharePoint Framework, rather on the organizational considerations. So essentially, what are those things what you should think through if you are a customer or a partner or a developer or an architect when you are either consuming or ordering, requesting somebody to develop a solution, or when you are designing and developing a SharePoint Framework solution. My name is Vesa Juvonen. I'm a Senior Program Manager from SharePoint Engineering, and with me as a co-speaker today is Waldek Mastergaards. So Waldek, will you do the introduction as well?
Hi everybody, my name is Waldek Mastergaards. I am Office Development MVP. I work as a product owner at Rancor. And today we will talk about SharePoint Framework organizational considerations.
Indeed, indeed. So we do not have, like mentioned, we do not have any actual code within this webcast, but we rather wanted to kind of raise awareness of considerations around these key topics, so that the customers and partners, when you're taking SharePoint Framework into use, you would actually think about those things from a day one, rather than thinking these processes or considerations afterwards when something already has been developed. Before we go to the actual content, just a quickly introduction to the SharePoint Patterns and Practices. So SharePoint Patterns and Practices is coordinated and owned by the SharePoint Engineering, but we do work together with community like MVPs and non-MVPs to provide code samples, guidance documentation. We have open community calls and case studies on the usage of the PnP patterns as well. The areas are on the SharePoint Framework, SharePoint Adding Model, Microsoft Graph, and Office 365 APIs in general. The SharePoint topics obviously quite often apply for on-premises as well. Currently, the SharePoint Adding Model is supported in on-premises. SharePoint Framework will be supported in 2016, SharePoint 2016 later this year. HTTP AKMS SharePoint PnP is the one address to remember, from where you can find links to all of our webcasts, links and samples and all of that stuff. But let's actually move into today's topic. So, organizational considerations. So let's actually talk about these things, and let's then go through what does it mean in practice as an interactive discussion together with Waldek. But anyway, so the SharePoint Framework is no doubt a new tool chain. So we need to understand the new tool chain, which has then new requirements for skill set as well. So there are new, if you are a classic SharePoint developer, this might take some time, and we do absolutely acknowledge that. And we are here to, as an example, the PnP is here to provide you guidance on how to learn the new skill set and the tool chain within your company. What you should be also considering is the client-side library usage, essentially meaning which of the libraries you would be using, how you're using them, and choosing the right way of talking against the SharePoint. And then the last topic, kind of in a high level, is the hosting location. Because the client-side web parts or the SharePoint Framework solutions in general, they are actually based on JavaScript. So they are client-side implementations, which are typically visible within the UI. You need to think through where those JavaScripts are actually hosted, because that will actually have an impact within your overall design. So putting all of these together, essentially, quite simply, means that you should have a governance plan. It doesn't matter if you're a customer or if you're a provider or an ISV or a system integrator, you should have a governance plan in place to think through how do we address this, let's say, these individual topics. So where do we host the stuff? What is the libraries which are we using? What does the new tool chain actually mean for your company? How do we actually train the people to use the new tool sets which are required, or to get the new skills for the new tool chain. Rambling on all by myself. So Waldek, anything you want to add on this one?
Yeah, sure. So as you've said, you should have a plan, no matter if you build SPFX solutions or only use them and order them from somebody else. You should have an idea. How are you going to deploy them, support them, from where you load them, how do they work, right? Because yes, if things break, you have to have an idea, you have to have a process in place, how are you going to solve the issue? So do you have to look up somewhere else because those scripts live on another location, or are they internal? So you have to have a global idea how to work around all of that, and how to have a process that goes end to end from the very start, how these solutions are being built into how they operate in production.
True, absolutely. And one thing to consider about the governance plan, quite often then people might freak out and say, hey, okay, we don't want to build 60 pages worth of a governance plan. And that's not what we actually mean with this. It could be 1 or 2 pages which are essentially just defining, hey, who do I contact, or what's the process when there's a requirement to start doing a SharePoint Framework solution? So what is the contact flow to get started? Who's then the person who's requesting that stuff to be developed? Who are we going to contact for the development? Who are the persons who are going to approve and validate and accept what is being delivered? And then if something breaks, because, well, eventually something might break, and quite often in IT is something we need to have that plan anyway in place, who do we actually contact? Who's responsible of fixing the situation if stuff is getting broken? And what's the SLA for doing that? Because obviously the SLA then defines the process as well. And that really is dependent on what are we actually implementing as well. Is it a business critical or not functionality which is in the UIs?
Right, and also essential part there is that actually this plan should be as simple as possible, because imagine that you have to be able to execute on the plan. So there is no point in creating a really exhaustive plan that you just put on a shelf and nobody can use because it is too complex, right? Absolutely. The point is that you have an action plan that is comprehensive, simple, and covers everything that you need, and that is actually made in a way that you can act upon it. So imagine that you would say that your company only accepts solutions that are built in React. So in other words, you have to have a process in place that will allow you to verify that every time you get a solution, you can actually verify that it's built in React and not in Angular. Right. So you have to have exactly not only the requirements, but also process in place that will allow you to verify that these requirements are met every single time.
True. Absolutely. Which essentially kind of oversimplifying that. Do not overkill with the governance plan, because we've seen that in the past with SharePoint quite often. I've seen so many governance plans being developed for customers, and then the governance plan is way too big, not flexible enough, and nobody's going to actually apply the plan in practice. So that was waste of money. So, and this doesn't, like mentioned, this doesn't have to be a massive, let's say, a document or a process, as long as those contact points are being defined. That's really the key point. Now, let's actually move on slightly, and we'll come back on the topics in the following slides as well. So when we're using SharePoint Framework, when we're implementing stuff on a SharePoint Framework, this is how the SharePoint Framework solution essentially is built. So whenever we are deploying a SharePoint Framework solution, we actually deploy a manifest file to the app catalog. And the manifest file is the one which is defining what is the solution which is available, where the JavaScript is being hosted, and what does the solution actually contain. But the solution file, SPPKG file, which is getting added on the app catalog, does not contain the actual customization. It does not contain the code. The code itself is hosted somewhere. The code itself can be hosted in CDN, open, anonymously accessible CDN. It could be hosted in SharePoint as well, on SharePoint Online. But the key point from a governance planning perspective is that you actually define that rule. Where do we host the JavaScript library? And if you are using whatever third-party libraries, which of the libraries are supported, or from where those libraries are referenced. Because you probably don't want to just randomly reference random JavaScript file all over the internet, because essentially the SharePoint Framework solution is being executed with the identity of the end user. And that means that if you reference a random file without any thinking from random location from the internet, you have a potential security challenge, which is exactly the reason why you should be thinking through the process and having that kind of a governance plan in place. Which are the locations which are safe? Where do we actually host the JavaScript? And what does it actually mean in practice? Good. Anything you want to add here, Walde?
Yeah, I guess that's the interesting part. There is also that the location where you host scripts also has to have, if you will, SLA in place, like who is allowed to update scripts and when. Sure. What's the process to update scripts? Because even though you might initially check that the script you actually use is safe and built correctly, if anyone is able to update that script without you even knowing about it, then it could be that in a week or in few days time, the contents of that script will change, and the script will do something else than what it did initially. Sure. So you have to have process in place. You have to know where do you load scripts from, and what the SLA around it is. So who is allowed to access, update these scripts, and when, right? So that's really a key point, because as you said, right, all scripts run as the current user, and if it's tenant admin who would come to the page, then in theory, that script has access to everything within tenant, right? So that's a key point there as well.
Absolutely, absolutely. And obviously, if that is a massive concern, you can always fall back on the adding model. And that's not really a falling back on the adding model, but that's really the key differentiator between the SharePoint Framework solution and the adding model. If you need to have a full isolation of the customization within a SharePoint Online, and you don't want to go through this approval process and verification and all of that, keep on using adding model, because that's based on OAuth, and it has the permission checkups and the isolation, and the scripts cannot actually access on behalf of the user functionalities, and that's a really key point. Now, we've mentioned quite a few things already, but let's kind of think this through first from a customer perspective. So if you're a customer, these are the things which would be the first things to actually think through. First of all, you want to standardize your client-side library. And this really actually is standardizing your JavaScript library, what is being used within your SharePoint Online tenant. We do support whatever libraries in SharePoint Framework, so you can actually use Vue, Angular, React, handlebars, it doesn't really matter. But the more libraries you put on a page, essentially if you have multiple web parts, the page size actually gets it's growing as well. And also the fact that if you have multiple different libraries, let's say developed by one ISV or system integrator, and then they will move on, and then after a while, in a year, you will need to do some changes, you might run into big significant challenges because you actually have multiple libraries in use, and can you find the skillful people who understand those libraries as well? So it's absolutely a good practice to standardize the client-side library which is being used. Is it a React, is it Angular, or is it something else? Let's try to stick on one library rather than having multiple. You also want to define a policy for your external scripts. Essentially, you want to make sure which of the external scripts can be used and from which location. And this really comes down on, for example, that what Waldek said related on the referencing external scripts from CDNs. You need to know from which locations are being referenced, so that those locations are essentially in quotes safe. And that refers to the hosting location. So you probably want to make sure that wherever you're referencing external scripts or the SharePoint Framework JavaScript solution scripts, the hosting location has been defined so that they're safe and you don't have to worry about JavaScript files getting suddenly updated. Technically, you don't have to refer external scripts. You are able to, for example, if you're using React or Angular, you're able to bundle those into the client-side script solutions as well, which has then additional implications. But it's really important to define those rules from a implementation perspective. And then the final point being the explicit agreement with ISVs. And this really refers to the fact that if you're buying a client-side solution from an ISV and they are hosting the JavaScript file from a centralized location, you probably want to make sure that there is a rules and guidelines on how the JavaScript file is hosted, what's the SLA for the JavaScript file, who has rights to change that JavaScript file in that centralized location or in the internet. Or you might actually fall back on the model where you define or you require that JavaScript file being hosted within your SharePoint Online tenant. And that's absolutely fine option as well. But those rules have to be defined as part of actual requirements within your solution. And that's what we would be asking customers to think through, or that would be a wise thing for customers to think through. Waldek, what did I miss?
Well, so there's one little thingy that I like to add with regards to choosing a framework or library that you want to use. So either React, Angular, or Vue, no matter which one, but pick one. And another aspect that is important with regards to that is that frameworks or the libraries evolve as well, right? And they are being patched, there are bugs in them. And if you use more than one, you have to also keep track of more than one, whether there are security bugs in them that needs to be patched. And if so, which ones? What is the update process, right? If you have only one, it's way easier for you to keep track. Let's say Angular, right? If there is development in that or there is important patch, it's easier to follow only one framework as opposite to become an expert and in Vue and in Angular and React and Handlebars and in everything else that you might and might not use, right? So that's also a key point, because at the end of the day, these solutions run on your tenant. And even if they have been built by somebody else, they run on your tenant under full under identity of the current user, right? So you have to be sure that they are safe, right? So with that, you should also ensure that you try to use as few libraries across the whole intranet as you can to simplify the maintenance for yourself, right? And as you said, the requirements, that's also a very important thing, to be able to wrap all of these requirements together and to give that ahead of time to either SI, ISV, or your internal IT, so that they know upfront what do you require of them. And it could be even the case that you require your things to be built in Angular where they only do React, right? So it could be the case that even they will say, well, we cannot even do it, or the price or time will go up because you ask us to do something in library that we do not know.
True, absolutely.
But it's important to have that discussion up front and not when things are already done.
True. Absolutely, it should be in the requirements of the request for getting something moving, regardless of the process and the model who's actually implementing that. Now, moving on to the other side, so the customer, whoever the customer is, it an in-house customer, is it a actual customer, and the development happens outsourced? You're getting requirements in. For a developer and architect perspective, there's few aspects to agree as well. Obviously, the library considerations, the hosting considerations, all of that actually applies to developers and architects as well. You need to understand those requirements, those implications, options, and all of that. But then in the actual development, obviously, you need to have a development plan on how do we do development? How do we work as a team? What is the actually tools we're using? What is just simplistic stuff? What is the source control system what we're actually using? Or where do we save or what is the scripting tooling what we're actually using? And how do we merge our stuff, and how do we do testing? How do we actually do integration testing, which is highly dependent on what kind of solution it is. Is it a one web part? Is it multiple web parts? Is it a web parts with the web API calls and all of that? So everything significantly depends on the scale of the solution. But really thinking through what is the testing process around quality assurance. Do we have a separate UAT process where somebody goes and signs off before it goes to the production? Do we use production, maybe potentially in an isolated site collection as the testing environment, or how do we actually move it on? And then what does the deployment to the production actually means? So what's the SLA for getting stuff to the production? Because the tenant administrator has to get that app files deployed. And that's really the one thing to agree as well, together with the customer, or the tenant administrator. And then also the considerations related on the updates and support. So who's actually responsible of supporting that, and what's the SLA around those changes which needs to be applied? So what is the promise we can actually give for the customer if there's requirements to do modifications, which is highly dependent, as an example, on the JavaScript hosting location. Because if you're an ISV or a system integrator, if you're hosting the JavaScript in your CDN or from a centralized location, you can update that easily if that agrees on the requirements and a plan with the customer. If in a deployment, however, the customer is hosting the JavaScript in their tenant, then the process for getting the updates done is completely different. Anything to add here, Waldek, from your side?
Absolutely. So if you go back to the requirements that we talked about before, they span across things like hosting location, framework, external scripts, and all that. And that determines also everything that you see here. So imagine that you would be an Angular house. When you have a requirement to do things in Angular, you might already have experience in that. But imagine that you want to expand your services, and you want to also be able to do things in React as well. So doing things in React will probably be different than doing things in Angular, and that spans from things like different tools, different way to test it, different quality checks, different coding styles even, right? So you have to have all of that in place, and that is based on the requirements that the customer gave you. And the same also applies to testing, right? Because there are frameworks that allow you to test solutions that work better with Angular than, for example, in React. And then if you would build stuff in React, then you would use another approach as well, right? So that's also a thing that you have to take into account, that the framework that you use or the library that you use determines your whole toolchain and approach from coding guides to testing, right? All of that. And also from support point of view, there is also an interesting point. So in the past, I've seen it a few times that a small shop would build solution to deploy it to customer, and then another company would support it. Well, in the past, it was all C#.NET, right? So it was quite easy story to support solution that somebody else built. Now with that, that's not really the case, because if you don't know React and you would have to support React solution, then it might mean that you have to have some additional ramp up. So that's why it's essential that you, before you accept supporting something, you understand how it's built, by whom it's built, and what scripts and libraries are being used, so that you can commit to it and actually be able to do it, as opposite to just accept it and then after the fact see, oh, but it's built in React. We don't know React,
True.
Right? So with that, you would not be able to deliver the SLA that you promised. Right? So that, yeah, sorry, go.
No. I'm thinking through this, going through the previous slides and the previous slide and this slide. One of the things what I actually, before we kind of ramp up on the webcast as well, is wanted to kind of have a chat with you, Waldek, is that, well, somebody listening to this webcast might feel like, hey, but isn't this kind of making the SharePoint Framework solution development super complex? All of these considerations, what we need to do. This sounds much more complex than it was in the farm solution timeframe or with adding model.
Yes and no, right? So in the past, there was one way to do things, if you will, and everybody had to do it that way. So from that point, it was simple. And it was not always the optimal way. You just had to...
What do you mean?
Sorry
for jumping on that one. What do you mean that there was one way of doing things? Because essentially, in a farm solution timeframe, we had a different C#, VB.NET. There was multiple other options, and also SharePoint customizations can be always done in multiple ways.
Right, but in the past, so if you would go back to 2008, right, we only had WSPs, and sure, you could do it with VBNet, but the majority did C#, right? So that was just majority, right? And back then, that was the only approach. Then we got Sandboxed, which in a way was similar to WSP, but not quite. Then we got add-ins. But that was still, if you will, it was still C#.NET, and it was the ramp up there was way easier than now if you would want to switch from Angular to React or Vue.
That's true. That's true.
Right.
And sorry for jumping on that one, but as an example, on the other hand, one of the considerations in a farm solution has always been the fact that in SharePoint, when you need to do a customization, you have multiple ways of doing that. Back in 2008 timeframe, yes, the language was typically the same, C#, but now you can actually develop C# in multiple different ways. And you can do visual web parts, or you can do inline HTML within a web part, or you can do user custom actions, or you can do site definitions, or you can do web templates. So all of that kind of essentially how stuff should have been implemented should have been actually in the governance plan as well, right?
Right. What I was trying to say, yeah, so what you said is true. But the way I see it is that it was more related to, it was still SharePoint, right? So there was a finite number of options that you had. Now with SPFX, I would say that there's probably framework released or library released every day. And there will be always a new version, a new library that does something better than something else.
Yeah.
Right? And with that, I think it will help you a lot at the end of the day if you just pick one and stick to using that as opposite to try to using the latest one. Because there will be a new library every day, every week.
Yeah.
And at the end of the day, you want to be efficient. You want to, whatever you build, you want to make that in a way that it's cost effective for everyone.
True.
Right? And chasing and rebuilding the build process, build chain solution itself as well is not going to help you with that. So with that, I would say that you should try to rationalize the libraries that you use and just pick one and stick with that, and not switch every month or every 3 months from one to another. I mean, sure, it's good to try and to see what is out there, but at the end of the day, pick one and use that as much as you can, really to be efficient.
Yeah. Good example is the Angular. So Angular 4.0 is going to be released relatively soon. So we just released 2.0. What's happening? So the speed is too fast, and people can't keep up. So, although let's say the dynamic web stack development in a smaller, let's say, companies might be completely different than the rules and setup which we need to do for enterprise companies or bigger companies in general. Good. So one of the things, so just to reference some of the resources which are available from the devtodos.com/SharePoint, which is the landing page for SharePoint development now and future. So we do have a separate article on the enterprise guidance, kind of raising considerations, what people should be thinking, and also on the team development. We didn't actually deep dive in this session on team development considerations too much, but there's that article is touching things like, hey, how do we do internal NPM or package structure or library sharing structures and other considerations like source code. So please have a look on those articles, and if something is missing, let us know, and we'll address that within the documentation as well. But a lot of talking, no demos, no code. That wasn't the intention. Really, the intention was to kind of educate. And the intention of this webcast was to raise awareness of the things what people should be considering. from a customer perspective and also from a partner perspective before you commit on doing something in a SharePoint framework. We obviously want people to use SharePoint framework, but it would be good that you would actually consider these things before stuff has been developed rather than afterwards when it actually might cause some issues. Anything you want to add there, Waldek?
Yeah, I would again encourage you to check out the links that we just had on the slide and try to wrap your head around requirements that you should have in place in order to be able to work effectively within the new toolchain and framework.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Excellent. I think that sums up the webcast. So thank you, Waldek, for joining me on the webcast, and we'll come up with a new webcast sooner or later. Thank you.
Bye, everybody.